What is a first-person shooter? In the 90s, id Software gave the world the answer to that question. But the truth is, it wasn't a simple process. There was a lot to be explored, both in technology and in design. What we take for granted now in first-person shooters was pioneered not just in id's early ventures, but also in their magnum opus at the time: Quake. While it may seem primitive now, Quake's influence and strides in game design and advanced engine techniques would send shockwaves through the industry. And you owe a lot of things you love about FPS games today to Quake, because without Quake, there would be no FPS. There would only be Doom clones. Quake showed us that it wasn't just a type of action game. It was a budding genre that would exponentially grow in the coming years. So let's analyze this series and see why it had a long-lasting effect on the video game industry, and despite its absence over the years, continues to do so. I'm Triforce, and this is the Legacy of Quake. Once upon a time, id Software revolutionized the way people look at 3D gaming with a little project known as Wolfenstein 3D. A couple years later, Doom hit the market, refining the way their previous game felt, and creating a high-octane action game that captivated countless people around the world. Despite the inability to aim freely, with bullets hitting enemies on the y-axis based on where you're facing on the x-axis, its primitive nature is negligible when in the face of everything else it does right. Reflecting on this success, however, id Software knew they could do more. Once the technology was available, they were ready to use it. Retrospectively, I look at the evolution of the first-person shooter as id Software's three-step plan to conquer 3D games. Wolfenstein 3D was step 1 in this journey. The concept was simple. Imagine the map layout of a dungeon from the original Legend of Zelda. What if you played through that dungeon from Link's point of view? This prompted id Software to use a graphical technique called raycasting. The game draws lines from the perspective of the character based on the existing map data. That's why Wolfenstein 3D doesn't have stairs or verticality in its level design. It's technically a 2D game. You're just seeing it from the eyes of the character. Using that graphics technique, they were able to create the illusion of playing the game in a 3D space. Raycasting also only renders the parts of the map that are visible to the player. While more complicated now, it's a technique that is still used to this day in games, and is done in order to save resources. When less is being loaded into the game at once, the result is a steadier frame rate and better overall performance. All of this was pioneered by John Carmack, a programmer who would continue to revolutionize computer graphics, primarily in video games. He's also a rocket scientist, and has made strides in that field as well. And because of this, he's probably the only person in the world qualified enough to say rocket science is easier than programming video games. Yeah, that's the talented id Software for you. Anyway, Carmack refined the engine over a couple of other projects like Hover Tank 3D and Catacomb 3D in 1991. But when 1992 rolled around, it was time to make that fast-paced action game the Office was so keen on making with that engine. Wolfenstein 3D was a great first attempt, but there was more left to be done. Step 2 was Doom. You guys know Doom, right? We all know Doom. Doom is a good game. Doom was also a technical marvel at the time of its release. The game's levels are built similarly to Wolfenstein 3D. However, a few new graphical and design tricks allow for a more intricate experience. Thanks to the game's unique adaptations of techniques from before, a lot of surfaces appear three-dimensional and different in size and angles. They can make the player appear on different levels of elevation, and thus create situations like this where you're surrounded by toxic waste. They allowed for stairs, switches, and various examples of non-linear level design. While the game still technically plays out on a single floor, the techniques they use and the way these new levels are laid out make the game seem leaps and bounds ahead of Wolfenstein. Their lighting engine allowed for strobe effects in areas further away from the player to appear darker, and most noticeably, the game actually has textures, and beautiful ones at that. The world of Doom was incredibly detailed and immersive at the time thanks to all this. It has a wider variety of enemies that attack differently, an incredible assortment of satisfying weapons, adrenaline-fueling power-ups, and a kick-ass metal MIDI score by Bobby Prince to top it all off. Honestly, some people may say id Software completely knocked it out of the park here. What else could be left in the field of 3D game design? A lot. A metric fuck-ton was left to be done. Which brings us to step 3. Quake is one hell of a game. While it would be the final stop in id's journey to perfect the art of 3D game design, it would start a snowball effect that would revolutionize the industry. It set a standard for a budding genre. It popularized online multiplayer. It had a versatile engine that pioneered things like support for 3D accelerated graphics cards, OpenGL, and client-side protection in multiplayer. It made people go out and buy dedicated graphics processors to run games from then on. The game's engine would be used for years to come, and would eventually be the base for other incredible engines. It was something special. As for the game itself, Quake let you move and look in any direction, and with this in mind, the game would change up the way keys were mapped forever in first-person shooters. Since Doom only required you to look left and right, you could play the game entirely using the arrow keys and a fire button, or with just the mouse. However, with the fully 3D nature of Quake, id quickly realized they needed a solution. Thus, the WASD mouse-look combo was born. While not initially well received by fans, I shouldn't have to tell you that decision worked out in the end. This freedom of movement in the Z-axis opened the floodgates for all kinds of creative levels and enemies. You can swim down underneath the water now, or rain hell on an enemy from above, for example. Two traversable spaces could finally be stacked on top of one another. Secrets were even trickier to unearth because of the endless possibilities for their locations. And there are even secret levels this time around that test you in different ways. I especially love the anti-gravity one. This is how you use 3 dimensions to your advantage. With all this at hand, no level is the same as the last. What makes Quake so notable 2 decades later, though, is how it uses its setting to its advantage. It uses everything at its disposal to make figuring out these levels an intense challenge. You may be finding keys and pressing buttons scattered throughout a level, but you're also fighting off relentless enemies in a dark and disturbing Lovecraftian hellscape as you attempt to do so. The game makes sure that solving necessary riddles are enhanced by everything else present. In terms of combat, there's even more to consider now. Thanks to this newfound freedom of movement, you have to predict where enemies are going to be in more diverse situations than Doom. You have to factor in the arc and the bounce of each grenade, as well as the travel time and trajectory of rockets. The nail gun may fire fast, but that also means it'll waste ammo if you miss. You need to make sure you can hit your target. These types of weapons may not be impressive now, but before Quake this was unheard of. However, the satisfying nature of landing your shots make the weapons extremely fun to use despite the invention of other novel video game guns since 1996. Enemies here are much stronger than enemies in Doom. They soak up your bullets and attack in a more aggressive manner. They'll lunge at you, they'll lob grenades at you, and they'll run at you with swords. Hell, sometimes they'll even fly. And because they don't go down that easily, you need to be mindful of which weapons you use and monitor your ammo. Some enemies go above and beyond your typical grunts though. They're especially memorable in how they're introduced and how they're used. The Shambler is introduced early on, and to me, it is perhaps one of the most challenging enemies to properly deal with in any FPS I've ever played. Getting close to one is out of the question thanks to its slam attack, but if you're far away, it'll use a bolt of electricity that magnetizes to you no matter where you're standing. You can take cover when it begins charging up, but you need to be quick. Not only does the enemy test your knowledge of movement, but also forces you to use whatever you can find as cover. One of the other enemies I adore shows up at the very end of episode 2. I distinctly remember the first time I ran into one. I thought I was clear, about to grab the rune and head through the slip gate, but as soon as that elevator made it to the bottom, I took one step and what the fuck is that? These enemies are relentless. They'll throw a homing orb at you that is fast and won't stop until it collides with something. The thing is though, these orbs are smart. They are programmed to round corners and come for you. It's an extremely scary, aggressive enemy and a great way to finish off the episode. This enemy is called a Vor. Yeah, okay, that's why I held off on saying anything. Get your laughs out now. Anyway, the best part about these enemies, both of them become recurring grunts as the game progresses and gets more difficult. It's awesome. And upon replaying the game, I strongly recommend playing on hard or nightmare difficulty. The placements of enemies are altered and the game is even scarier when enemies can jib you in a heartbeat. There is a notable downside to combat though, and those are the bosses. They're bad. Chthon at the end of episode 1 only requires you to walk over some switches to set up a trap and then you activate it. Then you repeat the process until he's dead. The final fight with Shub-Niggurath only has you walking through the slipgate with the position of the orb. Once it's flown into Shub-Niggurath, you walk through and you'll telefrag her. Pretty awesome concept, but it's piss easy. It sucks too because I love her design. Technically, this game's Shub-Niggurath is based on the design of the Beast's Thousand Young, but the thing became the template for the Quake logo. It'd be dumb to just call it one of its Thousand Young. Anyway, the best end of episode challenges are ones like where you face the Vors coming out of the elevator. Episode 3 ends with something similar to this. You're over a pit of lava and there's not much room to move. You have to be really careful when killing all of the other enemies. I really wish they didn't go halfway with bosses. Either go one way or the other. And based on what's present in the game, introducing really powerful enemies at the end of each episode probably would have been more fun. Regardless, the game plays well. This is a surprise to no one. But there's another big reason I consider this game intense and compelling, and that's its overall presentation. Quake is an excellent example of using style to its advantage on technically incapable hardware. While Quake obviously looked amazing at the time due to its technical prowess, it's held up considerably due to its creepy texture work and atmosphere. The disturbing designs for the enemies, the purple sky that looms over you, the blood-coated walls and rough textures all make for excellent art direction. I especially like this game's use of shadows. In levels with long, tight corridors and not much room to breathe overall, I feel genuinely scared due to my only source of light being the bullets in my guns. But those aren't the only reasons I get my socks spooked off when I play Quake. No. There is one man responsible for my favorite element of Quake's horror. Trent Reznor had been a fan of Doom since its release, and he met the leads of id Software at a Nine Inch Nails concert. He went to their offices, and then he was asked to work on the music and sound design for Quake. This included full voice acting for the ranger you control, and yes, that means he made the lava screamer reality. Trent is most well known for his ability to create unusual, uncomfortable, yet groundbreaking soundscapes. His work in Nine Inch Nails has been absolutely phenomenal in demonstrating this. The Downward Spiral released just a couple of years before Quake came out, and its unnerving dive into the world of self-destruction definitely played a hand in convincing id that Trent was the right person for the task of scoring this Lovecraftian nightmare. Whereas Doom encouraged you to push forward whenever you felt overwhelmed by demons thanks to its head-banging metal midis, Quake does not. Quake's music threatens you in every way imaginable. It never aims to give you a reason to move forward. You have to face your own fears to beat this game. Trent represents this fear through sound in a number of ways. The Quake soundtrack is known for its cacophonous drones, and they aren't just there to sit in the background. They're enhanced by details like this. This track not only has bassy drones that are much louder than the others, but it also uses unusual hellish instrumentation that becomes more noticeable as the track progresses, that sometimes even represents the screams of the damned. Trent used the repeating drone as a base, and continued to add on to it. So as you progress through the level and more challenges present themselves, the track begins to emulate the process of slowly losing your sanity to the monsters around you. I remember this track playing in the level with several tight corridors looping around, and a cramped basement underneath. It was claustrophobic as all hell. Here's a similar track. This one also uses drones, although they are much less pronounced and sound metallic in nature. It also has extremely disturbing whimpers to back up its overall ominous sound. I think its subtle nature makes it even creepier than the previous track. My favorite track in the game aside from the main theme has to be this one though, and I urge you to listen to it with headphones. Without spoiling anything, its genius composition and mixing may not be as apparent without headphones. When this track starts, you might think it's just going to be whispers and drones for the whole thing. Then another sound comes in. The way it's composed makes it sound like it's tapping into your ears. This, combined with the distorted guitar riffs, add to the song's already unsettling feel. Then the tapping reaches a higher frequency and is amplified to sound like it's tapping into your throat. distortion and soundscape becomes even more complex. Despite being a 23-year-old soundtrack, it sounds like it could have been released yesterday. Just like a lot of Nine Inch Nails' music. It's so modern, so ahead of its time, and it does more than just fit the game. It single-handedly brings the game's horror to another level. And that's why I love Quake. It's more than just mindless fragging. It's intense. It preys on your fears. It uses technology to its advantage, whether that be through new innovations back then, or primitiveness now. It was a groundbreaking technical achievement in 1996, and it still holds up today due to its timelessly satisfying design and brutal Lovecraftian horror setting. But there's one component of Quake that I've neglected to talk about, and that's the online multiplayer. Speaking of technology, Quake would be the first game to shoot online multiplayer into the mainstream. Doom had a simplified version beforehand for 2 to 4 players that allowed you to play cooperatively or competitively with your friends. But Quake's multiplayer became a phenomenon for a number of reasons. For starters, it supported up to 8 players, and jibbing your friends became so much easier. Quake was released at a time when internet access was becoming more and more common around the world. Thus, more people became aware of the idea of online multiplayer. The ability to host dedicated servers was also a big deal back then. Rather than connecting over a local network, you could finally play with anyone who had Quake across the nation. However, this also presented a new problem. If someone with a poor connection were to play on your server, everyone would be affected by that connection and input delay would be the result. This brought about the QuakeWorld client, in which client-side protection allowed everyone to have accurate movements not hampered by input delay, regardless of your connection. This became the standard, and thanks to this new model, online play is commonplace to say the least. The multiplayer itself did more than just revolutionize the industry though. This was where the depth of Quake's movement would be discovered. Techniques like bunny hopping, strafe jumping, and rocket jumping became frequently used during matches. Bunny hopping is simple enough. Just repeatedly jump and hold forward to keep your speed going. Same goes for rocket jumping. Just fire a rocket at the ground as you're initiating a jump to gain extra height. Actually, rocket jumping wasn't exclusively a multiplayer discovery. There's a slipgate in the campaign that requires either a grenade-boosted or rocket-boosted jump to access. You could even argue that bunny hopping is something that we all tried to get out of stressful situations in the campaign. I always force myself to think on my feet in near-death encounters in Quake, theorizing that maybe, just maybe, jumping might be faster than holding forward. There's even ground to this theory of experimentation in the game's difficulty and episode select areas. Rather than giving you a menu, Quake does something novel in giving you a choice through divided paths when you select your difficulty. You get to figure out how the game controls before you start fragging. And once you attempt a subsequent playthrough, your resourcefulness might just reward you with nightmare difficulty. It's great. Strafe jumping is more complex, however, and likely wouldn't have been discovered by just anyone playing the campaign. Here's why. You start by initiating a bunny hop, while also holding one of the 2 strafe keys at the same time. While repeatedly jumping, you turn your mouse slowly in the direction you want to move. In order to maintain an optimal strafe jump, you must know the path ahead of you, and continually alternate between the 2 strafe keys in the direction of your mouse turn in order to navigate. This will result in you exceeding the game's speed cap, because truthfully, strafe jumping is the result of a bug in the game's code. However, it became such a common technique that id Software would actually encourage it in future Quake games. While these techniques do take immense practice, they became second nature for a lot of players. So much so that advanced Quake gameplay prompted tournaments to start popping up across the United States, most notably the Red Annihilation and id's own QuakeCon. Quake became one of the first games to pioneer esports. In addition to all this, Quake became known for its enthusiastic modding scene. Fans would continue to support the game and create new modes and maps for it for years to come. Modes like Capture the Flag would become instant classics, and full-fledged games would originate from mods for Quake like good old Team Fortress. It's impossible for me to understate just how many mods were made for Quake. The game was a cultural phenomenon. And even then, there's still something we haven't discussed yet. Something big. Something that would only be possible with the Quake engine at the time. Half-Life. Valve's debut title that would spawn the game series responsible for their success was developed using a modified version of the Quake engine, Gold Source. Valve would eventually go on to have its own modding community for their game, which would spawn the official release for Team Fortress after the game was ported to Gold Source, as well as releases for fan-made mods on Gold Source like Counter-Strike and Day of Defeat. These became Valve franchises, and when Valve was in a financially viable place, they developed the Source engine using that old Quake engine as a base. They would create one of the most flexible game engines of all time, develop a sequel to their acclaimed game on it, which in turn became hailed as one of the greatest games ever made, which was launched on the platform that would make them the most profitable company per employee in the United States. All of this might not have happened without Quake, or at least, if it did, it wouldn't have happened in the same way. I won't neglect the talented people behind Half-Life that made it the game series it is. It wouldn't be any good without them, but Quake had a factor in kickstarting Valve's success. I say this because Sierra was looking for a Quake engine game to fund back when Half-Life was pitched. Right place, right time. An ambitious project like Half-Life would have scared away several publishers, but Valve happened to find the right people. A similar story to the Darksiders pitch I discussed in an earlier video. THQ was the last publisher Vigil Games met with that day, and they happened to meet them at the right time. THQ really wanted an original IP, rather than just continuing to publish licensed content. Once again, when pitching something, coinciding with what the publishers want plays a major part in your product getting picked up. Looking back now, it's clear that Quake became the reason a lot of developers could launch their careers. The people at Valve could flex their creative muscles and set the standard for video games for years to come, thanks to an engine that gave them the tools to do so. If that isn't a testament to a great game with an accessible and viable engine, I don't know what to tell you. So what was next for Quake? Where did id Software decide to go from there? Well, unfortunately, after Quake's release, John Romero left id due to internal disputes about the future of the company. He had basically no involvement in the project that would eventually become Quake II. I don't mean to make it out to be a bad game though, because it's not. It's pretty fucking sweet. It actually has better controls than the original game, making advanced movement a lot easier to pull off. Clearly id had been listening to feedback on the original game's multiplayer. It's more refined, easier to jump into, and actually had maps specifically created for multiplayer this time. It would also be the first glimpse the world would get into mechanics being optimized for multiplayer Quake matches. For example, the railgun in campaign may be powerful, but it's much more satisfying to use in multiplayer. It basically one-shots enemies. The power of this weapon is balanced out by how much other players will be maneuvering in a match, and your own ability to aim. Speaking of focusing on multiplayer, the mode that originated as a mod, Capture the Flag, was adapted into Quake II as a full-fledged game mode available out of the box. The one thing that they changed that I am very disappointed with is the change in setting. Now all we have is a generic sci-fi setting with an enemy known as the Strogg. Your name, Johnny Quake. Your mission, protect Earth from an alien invasion. I don't care for it much. It upsets me too because you could do so much more in a Lovecraftian setting with up-and-coming storytelling devices games began using around the time of Quake II's release. Remember how I mentioned Shub de Gurov's design in Quake I was actually based on one of her Thousand Young? Well, that'd be a great way to drive the player forward in a sequel. Bring me more Lovecraftian beasts. I want more. Instead, we have this snooze cruise of a setting. I mean, other than that, Quake II is an adrenaline rush. Jibbing countless enemies while you rush your way through id's iconic maze-like level designs is an absolute treat. And there's something I forgot to mention. John Romero did at least have a little bit of input over Quake II. After Sonic Mayhem sent his alternate soundtrack for Quake to id Software in 1996, John Romero asked him personally to score Quake II before he left the company. The result? Well... Quake II's metal soundtrack and turn your brain off and shoot things gameplay go together like peanut butter and jelly. It carries with it some of the most memorable riffs and melodies I've heard in game music, all presented through unapologetically brutal yet unquestionably catchy instrumentation. And Sonic Mayhem would stick around for the inevitable third installment, only this time, things would be a little different. Quake III Arena would lack a single-player campaign, possibly due to Quake II's uninspired setting and it being completely shown up by Half-Life's take on science fiction. Instead, id would funnel all of their creative juices into a balls-to-the-wall multiplayer experience. They did exactly what they set out to accomplish, and more. Quake III Arena took everything the competitive community raved about and threw it all into one big fun-filled fragfest. I previously mentioned how Quake II improved on its controls and mechanics. Quake III does more than that. It controls and plays perfectly, and the new stages are designed with advanced techniques in mind. Slopes, roundabouts, launch pads, the works. It throws in weapons from across the series, and reworks them to fit perfectly into a multiplayer-driven game. For example, bringing back the Thunderbolt from Quake I was an excellent choice. Now known as the Lightning Gun, its ability to frag is only as useful as your ability to track other players. Quake III's impeccable sound design should also be noted. The sound that you hear when you land a shot on another player is iconic, and it was a satisfying way to let you know that you've hit your mark. And with automatic weapons, hearing it repeat itself over and over as you land every single shot is orgasmic. This is backed up by the announcer praising your actions and keeping you updated on the progress of a match. Even small details aren't overlooked. The railgun is powerful, as we all know by now. However, in between shots it emits a humming noise that can be useful in letting you know that you need to get the fuck out of there. Throw in the sounds of other players bunny hopping around the arena, weapons firing all over the place, and the drum and bass / metal soundtrack by Sonic Mayhem, and you have a powerful concoction for your eardrums. But Quake III wasn't just appealing for a few months. Fan-made modes and maps were popping up all over the server browser. It became an instant hit. So much so that it's still being played frequently to this day. Tournaments are held annually at QuakeCon and other events, and it has since become the only Quake game to get a remaster. This game was a huge deal. Looking back, it was very much iterative. Whether or not you prefer Quake II over 3 is largely subjective, but Quake 3 was way more accessible. And that's probably why it stuck around for so long. The single-player option allows you to get used to how the game plays by training with bots, and the game progressively changes the amount of bots you're up against, their difficulty, the map you're playing on, etc. Also, the server browser made playing multiplayer matches easier than ever before. You could take the game out of the box, and as long as you're connected to the internet, you select a match and boom, happy fragging. Combine these quality of life changes with the timeless gameplay, brilliant map design, and community support, and you have a game that's built to last forever. Quake III Arena ran on id Tech 3, a completely new engine developed specifically for the game. This engine would be used for a multitude of games, most notably Call of Duty. The game was developed as a direct competitor to Medal of Honor, and we all know how that worked out. Coincidentally, id Tech 3 would also be the engine used for Medal of Honor's PC debut, Allied Assault. So two competing shooters would use the same engine thanks to its ease of access. How about that? Call of Duty's developers, Infinity Ward, would continue to build off of id Tech 3 and create iterative versions of their own proprietary engine. Yet again, id Software's tech would kickstart another extremely successful franchise. So yeah, id Software had released something that revolutionized shooters and gaming in general. Whether that be through features, esports, or tech, they were on top when it came to pioneering things in the industry. But at the turn of the 21st century, however, Quake would be absent from the minds of many video game fans. Sure, Quake fans kept playing Quake, but the general public turned their attention to many other series. Here's why. For starters, the focus on grounded, realistic combat became a huge focus of successful FPS games from the early to mid-2000s. Games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty back in the day were easy for anyone to pick up because of this. There wasn't any bunny hopping or crazy movement techniques to master, it was just you, your gun, and your opponent. Less interesting? Most of the time, perhaps. But this created a rift between people that grew up with Quake and people that grew up with Call of Duty. Retrospectively, both series had simple yet effective gameplay that was easy to get into, but they were drastically different in practice. That's why when I ask my friends if they want to play Quake, they say, "Oh, I can't get into arena shooters." Not because they are horribly complex games, but because they play at a much different pace than what would be considered fast and frantic for them. Call of Duty can be fast and frantic, no question, thanks to its pop-and-go nature of combat. With most classes, you can't stop moving if you want to survive. But that can't stop moving mentality is much different than a bunny-hopping rocket launcher user's mentality in Quake. Quake was easy to get into because there wasn't anything like it at the time. However, post-Quake shooters offered an alternative. Some people were first exposed to shooters through those games, and that's where the rift was created. What Quake needed was a reboot. A single-player experience that would reintroduce the world to arena shooters. Yeah, that's what Quake needed. What we got instead was Quake IV. Let's play a little game here. Our subjects are two games, Doom 3 and Quake IV. I'm going to give you the description, and you have to guess which game I'm describing. Ready? Here we go. The game at least had survival horror going for it, and the tech involved rivaled Half-Life 2 at the time, but with its linear corridor-esque levels that have no incentive for exploration, combat that feels extremely generic and less involved than other shooters of its era, and a painfully boring plot that shouldn't have taken the forefront through scripted events and cutscenes. Now, what do you think the answer was? Well, no matter what you guessed, you're right. This wasn't a very great time for id Software. I'd argue that Quake IV might even be worse than Doom 3, because at least Doom 3 had the hell levels going for it. Those actually felt pretty arena-esque and Doom-like, and the enemies you fought put up more of a challenge. Overall, the atmosphere was a lot better too. But Quake IV doesn't really have any interesting levels, and it also has turret sections. Yeah, let's take away all freedom of movement from you. The very thing that Quake thrived in since day one. Quake IV feels like the very antithesis of a Quake game. These games felt like id Software was trying desperately to keep up with what were setting industry standards at the time, because for the first time ever, they were threatened by other shooters. Valve had Half-Life 2, Activision had Call of Duty, EA had Medal of Honor and Battlefield, Microsoft had Halo, Sony had Killzone, etc. Things were different now. id weren't the revolutionary ones anymore. However, in creating these games in an effort to stay relevant, they forgot something vital along the way. Their older games were the reason they had competitors to begin with. They inspired these developers to think bigger. These amateur developers were using id Software's tech at the time. They learned from id. It was time to keep teaching and learning with your own games, rather than borrowing from others. It would take a little longer for id to come to this realization, but they finally did when they made a modern classic in 2016. The Doom reboot took what made a good shooter in the modern day and stripped away the unnecessary bullshit. While its focus on scripted events at times made playing through it cumbersome considering its pace, everything else about it was fucking brilliant. And I made a full-length video about it if you want to check it out. Overall, this is just my theory on id's fall from grace, but I think it's a pretty believable one. id were so adamant that they keep up with the industry, when in actuality, they were the reason that industry was in the place it was at the time. Now we have Quake Champions. While it does have character-specific stats and ultimates, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It adds some much-needed diversity to the Quake formula, in a world so crowded with multiplayer shooters. I won't critique it in its current state at the risk of dating this video because it's constantly changing since it's in early access, but it's free to play and has the most active player base out of any game I've talked about in this video. It's worth giving a shot. I play it every now and then, keeping up with it as much as possible. It's Quake. It's not the return all of us wanted, but it's Quake. And the brand new soundtrack composed by Andrew Hulshult is brilliant. It dynamically changes based on the status of your match. For example, in this song, if you're losing, the tempo and percussion will sound hurried in an attempt to push you forward. When you're tied, the instruments will sound like they're edging on a drop. Then, as you scoop up victory, the instruments go full-on adrenaline. Andrew is a phenomenal composer, as he can balance the metal sound of Quake II onward with the drones and unique sound of the original game. As I play Quake Champions, I remind myself of how glad I am that Quake is still alive and well. But I can't help but long for a game that feels like Quake 1. I want something that scares me while simultaneously giving me the adrenaline rush I crave. Something that reintroduces arena shooters to the modern era without feeling botched like Quake Champions feels at times. Something that parallels the rush of strafe jumping with an immediately accessible mechanic. Something I can show my friends and they can immediately grasp without asking too many questions. Something that balances metal goodness with an incredibly creepy score. If only something like that existed. Oh. Oh my god. Quake left behind an incredible legacy that cannot be overstated. The original game revolutionized 3D game design and had a unique Lovecraftian atmosphere that was enriched in detail. And it created multiplayer game types like Capture the Flag thanks to its community. It would spawn game types like Team Fortress thanks to its modding scene, and Half-Life and Call of Duty thanks to its adaptable engines. It started Valve and many other developers on the path to success. It created an enthusiastic community that still plays to this day. Features they pioneered set the standard for many multiplayer games to come. Chances are, if there's a shooter you like nowadays, you can probably trace its DNA back to Quake. Overwatch? Inspired by Team Fortress 2, which is a sequel to a Quake mod. Titanfall 2 runs on Source, which is the engine used to power the sequel to a game that ran on the Quake engine. It's a never-ending daisy chain that you can follow back to Quake, and that's a legacy worth keeping in mind. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you thought about how Quake has changed not just first-person shooters, but the game industry overall. I've been Triforce, and I'd like to thank you for watching.